Hello, and welcome to this video tutorial on the API plugin. The API plugin is a powerful tool that helps you create, execute, and manage API test cases within your organization. With this plugin, you can automate API testing to ensure seamless integration, performance validation, and load testing of your endpoints. Let's get started. Navigate to the API plugin by clicking on this icon. Once inside, you'll see a well-structured interface designed for efficient API test case management. The interface consists of two main sections. The left panel displays existing API test cases, making them easy to manage. The right panel provides configurations for request setup, authentication, response validation, and performance metrics such as execution time and load testing capabilities. Let's create a new API test case. Click the plus button here. This opens a side sheet where we can enter a title, for example, User Session API Test. You can also add a detailed description if needed. To keep your test well organized, you can link it to a sprint, feature, user story, or epic, and add relevant tags for easy tracking. Once all fields are completed, click Create, and the test case will be added to the left panel. Now, let's structure the test into steps. Steps are used to group API calls together, and you can have multiple steps. However, to create an API call, you must have at least one step. In this tutorial, we will create three key steps: initialize, process, and finalize. The initialize step sets up the session, including authentication and any necessary setup. The process step executes the core API calls, such as creating or retrieving data. The finalize step completes the workflow, including actions like logging out. Let's start by creating the initialize step. Click the three dots icon here and select Add New Step. In the pop-up window, enter the title Initialize and click Create. Once created, the initialize step will be displayed in the interface. Now, follow the same process to add the process and finalize steps. Now that we have our test structure, let's add API calls inside each step. Let's begin with initialize. Click the three dots icon here and select Add New API. In the pop-up window, enter the title Login and click Create. Once created, the API call will be added under the initialize step. Now, let's configure the request details, such as method type, get, post, etc., endpoint URL, request headers, body parameters. For this tutorial, we will be obtaining API endpoints from DocMost, an open-source documentation application. Let's open DocMost and enter our login credentials. Before clicking the login button, inspect the page to locate the login API endpoint. Here it is. Let's copy this endpoint and paste it in the URL field Login API call. Select Post, since this is a post request. Also configure both the headers and the body as required for a post request. Now, let's add the request headers. Open DocMost and locate the Login API endpoint. Click on the Headers tab. Inside Request Headers, you will see content type, application/JSON. Copy that and enter this in the Headers section here. Now that we've added the headers, let's get the request body. In DocMost, navigate to the Payload tab of the Login API endpoint. Click on View Source to see the request body in JSON format. Copy the JSON body, switch back to the API plugin, and paste it into the body section like this. Once the request is fully configured, we are ready to test the endpoint. Click Save to store the configuration. Then click the Send button to execute the request. You will now see the response for the endpoint. To verify, go back to DocMost, open the Login API endpoint, and switch to the Response tab. Here, you will see the same response that we got in the Login API call. Next, let's create another API call. Click the three dots icon and select Add New API. Enter the title Me and click Create. Now, we will configure this API request just as we did with the Login API, but this time, we will use a different endpoint. Open DocMost and locate the Me API endpoint. Copy this endpoint and paste it here. Select Post, since this is also a post request. Since this part of the URL remains the same, we will define a variable to avoid repetition and keep the test case structured. Click on API Variables. This opens a table-like interface where we can enter a variable name and value. In the variable name field, base URL. In the value field, enter https://docmost.test.smartester.io/API. Click OK to save the variable. The variables we create are global variables for this particular API test, User Session API Test. Now, let's update our API endpoints to use this variable instead of manually entering the full URL. For the Me API call, remove the full URL and write baserl.com/users/me. You can now see the base URL in green color, which indicates the variable is assigned correctly. If it's red, the variable is not created. Do the same for the login API call. Now, let's configure the request headers for Me API call. Open DocMost and locate the Me API endpoint. Click on the Headers tab. Inside Request Headers, you will see Content Type and Cookie. Switch to the API plugin and enter these headers in the Headers section. Unlike the Login API, the Me API does not require a request body, so we will leave the body section empty. Once the request is fully configured, we are ready to test the endpoint. Click Save to store the configuration. Then click the Send button to execute the request. You will now see the response for the endpoint. To verify, go back to DocMost, open the Me API endpoint, and switch to the Response tab. Here, you will see the same response that we got in the Me API call. Now, let's create another API call named Recents and configure its request details. Open DocMost and find the Recents API endpoint. Copy the endpoint and paste it into the Recents API URL field. Select Post since this is also a post request. Set up the request headers and body, as we did for the Login and Me API calls. Here, we can see that the Recents API call uses the same cookie header as the Me API call, so to avoid repetition, create a variable for the cookie. Click on API Variables and create a variable named Cookie. Assign the cookie value to it. Click OK to save the variable. Now update your cookie value to use this variable instead of entering the cookie value manually. Remove the hard-coded cookie value and replace it with this. Do the same for the cookie in the Me API call. Once everything is set up, click Save to store the configuration. Then, click Send to execute the request and view the response. If needed, verify the response using the same approach as before. Next, let's create another API call named Create and configure its request details. Open DocMost and click on General to open the workspace. Click on the icon here to open the sidebar. Before clicking New Page, inspect the page to locate the Create API endpoint. Once found, copy the endpoint and paste it into the Create API URL field. Select Post, since this is also a post request. Configure the request headers and body just as we did for the other API calls. Once everything is set up, click Save to store the configuration. Then click Send to execute the request and view the response. If needed, verify the response using the same approach as before. Finally, let's create another API call named Logout under Finalize and configure its request details. Open DocMost and click on the Profile drop-down menu. Click on Logout. Before clicking Logout, inspect the page to locate the Logout API endpoint. Once found, copy the endpoint and paste it into the Logout API URL field. Select Post since this is also a post request. Set up the request headers and body in the same way as we did before. Once everything is set up, click Save to store the configuration. Then, click Send to execute the request and view the response. If needed, verify the response using the same approach as before. Now that all API calls are configured, let's execute them together. Check the checkbox next to each API call to select them all. Click on Run and select API Test Gateway. Choose an appropriate gateway from the available options. Click Confirm to start the test. Once the test is complete, the results will be displayed. If you need to inspect the response of any specific API call, simply click on it to view the details. Now, let's explore the advanced options, Prescript and Postscript. These scripts help automate repetitive tasks, making API testing faster and reducing manual work. Let me show you how to use it with a login API call. Navigate to the login API call. Click on Prescript. Prescripts usually run before the API request. They are used to set up data, generate tokens, or modify request parameters dynamically. And PostScripts are generally run after the API response. They help in validating responses, extracting data, and chaining requests for further testing. Now, let's start configuring the Prescript. In the login API call, go to the body section. Here, you will see that we are sending the password as part of the request body. Instead of hard-coding the password, we can define it in a Prescript. Set the password in the Smart Tester environment like this, STENV. Set password tester at 123456778. Replace the actual password value with the environment variable, just like we used API variables before. If you are testing in proxy mode by clicking Send, you need to manually create an API variable for the cookie. If not set, the response will return an unauthorized error. If you are running the test on gateway mode, this extra step is not required. Since we are running in gateway mode, so click on Run and select API Test Gateway. Choose an appropriate gateway from the available options. Click Confirm to start the test. Once the test is complete, the results will be displayed. If you need to inspect the response, simply click on the API call to view the details. Now let's move on to PostScript. For example, if you check the API calls other than the login API call, you'll see that they require a cookie in the header section. Instead of manually entering the cookie for each request, we can use a PostScript to automatically store it as a variable and reuse it across all API calls. Let's inspect the response headers of the login API call. Here we can see that the set cookie header is included. This means we can extract the cookie value from the response and store it as a variable for later use. To create the PostScript, navigate to the PostScript section of the login API call. At the top right corner, you'll see a code button. This button helps generate scripts from the response data. Before using it, make sure you have executed the API call at least once. Click on the code button. Here, if you need to generate a script for success, click on Success, and a script will appear in the field here. Click Add to insert it into the PostScript. However, since we need to extract the cookie from the response headers, we need to write the script manually. Now, let's manually write the script to store the cookie value like this. Now, instead of manually entering the cookie in every API request, we can reference this stored variable in the header section of other API calls. When the login API runs, the cookie is stored in the variable. And since we reference it in other API calls, it will automatically be passed along with each request. If you are testing in proxy mode by clicking Send, you need to manually create an API variable for the cookie. If you are running the test in gateway mode, this extra step is not required. Since we are running in gateway mode, click on Run and select API Test Gateway. Choose an appropriate gateway from the available options and click Confirm to start the test. Once the test is complete, the results will be displayed. If you need to inspect the response, simply click on the API call to view its details. Now, let's move on to the final section, Performance Testing. To start a performance test, click on the Performance button available on each step. This opens a configuration window where you can set the number of concurrent users, iterations, and interval for performance testing. Set the concurrent users to 5, loop count to 5, and keep the interval at its default value. Once all fields are configured, click Save. Repeat the same steps for process and finalize since we are running a performance test for all steps. Check the checkbox next to each API call to select them all. Click on Run and select Performance Test Gateway. Choose an appropriate gateway from the available options. Click Confirm to start the test. The performance test may take a little time to complete. Once the test is complete, the results will be displayed. To view the performance results, switch to the Performance tab. Here, the results are listed in a table format. To visualize the results in different ways, switch to the Bar tab to view a bar chart representation. Alternatively, go to the Pie tab to see the results in a pie chart format. That brings us to the end of this tutorial. Thank you for watching this tutorial on the API plugin. See you in the next video and happy testing.